Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander far away from your cozy modern bed, your soft sheets, and that warm glow of your phone screen, and instead settle into the smoky, straw-filled huts of medieval peasants. Imagine yourself trudging through ankle-deep mud in the middle of winter, the icy wind cutting into your face, and knowing that the only thing waiting for you at home is a mud hut with holes in the walls. Sounds like you're about to freeze, right? You probably won't survive this night unless you learn the strange tricks those long-ago peasants used. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've probably heard the myth before. Peasants practically slept naked in the snow. Poor things. Hollywood loves to show them huddled in ragged tunics, teeth chattering, as if the Middle Ages were one long ice bucket challenge. It makes for dramatic storytelling, but if you actually slept that way, you'd last maybe 5 minutes before becoming a medieval popsicle. Think of it like the world's least fun spa treatment. Snow therapy, guaranteed to kill you. Here's the flip. Medieval peasants were a lot tougher and cleverer than the myth suggests. They didn't just collapse into bed and hope for the best. They layered clothes strategically, often sleeping in their shifts-loose linen undergarments that doubled as nightshirts. They wrapped themselves in whatever woolen blankets or patched together cloaks they could manage. And yes, wool wasn't just for nobles. Even the poorest could often get scraps. Of course, wool spun roughly on a spindle. Imagine wearing the sweater ever, then never taking it off. Cozy? Maybe not. Effective? Absolutely. The proof is everywhere once you start digging. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Household accounts and manorial records from England in the 13th century. Note bedclothes issued to laborers, often made of wool blends, not silk sheets. Sure, but they weren't going to bed in their birthday suits. For a quirky tidbit, listen to this. Archaeologists have found remnants of straw mats and even stuffed ticks, essentially early mattresses that peasants filled with whatever plant material they had. Straw gave off compost heat as it broke down, meaning that your bed was basically a low-tech heated blanket. The catch: after a while, the straw got moldy, smelly, and full of bugs. Imagine waking up to find a beetle crawling across your face. Not the dream bedtime story, but hey, at least you weren't frozen solid. And then there's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether peasants slept with all their outer garments on or preferred to strip down to underclothes at night. Some argue that constant wear would grind dirt into the skin, causing sores. Others counter that owning only one set of clothes made stripping down impossible. It's the medieval version of today's pajama debate. Team sleep in boxers vs. Team sleep fully dressed. Only back then, the stakes were life or frostbite. Now let's not forget our little jokes to keep things warm. First, imagine explaining to a medieval peasant that in 2025 people pay money for cold plunge therapy. He'd stare at you like you'd just suggested sunbathing in January. Second, if you'd handed them a modern heated blanket, they'd probably have assumed it was sorcery and burned you at the stake. Talk about a shocking product review. Third, remember the crocodile dung sunscreen joke from earlier? If that existed back then, they probably would have stuffed it in their mattresses too, just to see if it worked. So, the punchline: you don't need goose-down comforters to survive a bitter winter's night. Need grit, scratchy wool, and the ability to sleep on rotting straw while ignoring the occasional flea circus. makes your lumpy pillow suddenly feel like luxury, doesn't it? You've probably pictured the classic medieval hut as a drafty, miserable little shack, 4 sticks, a roof of straw, and a door that flaps in the wind like the lid of a cardboard box. The myth goes, peasants froze because their homes were basically wooden refrigerators. Admit I too imagined them shivering in corners while snowflakes fell right through the thatch. It's an easy image to believe because, let's face it, mud hut doesn't sound like prime real estate. If Zillow existed in 1250, those huts would have gotten 1-star reviews. Asterisk, cold, smoky, and smells faintly of livestock. Do not recommend. But here's the flip. Huts weren't as hopeless as we imagine. Step inside and you'd notice design elements that worked surprisingly well against the cold. Wattle-and-daub walls, sticks woven together and packed with mud, clay, and dung acted like natural insulation. When the mud dried, it hardened into a solid surface that trapped heat. Thatch roofs, though leaky in heavy rain, created thick layers of dried reeds that held warmth in like a giant beehive. And those low ceilings, they weren't built to annoy tall people. They kept heat from rising too far overhead. You wouldn't call it central heating, but you also wouldn't call it an igloo with holes. Let's pull in some proof. Mainstream historical fact. Building surveys from manorial estates in England note that even the poorest huts were often daubed and well-strawed, which means they were sealed against wind more effectively than the myth suggests. Thatched roofs could be several feet thick, providing insulation comparable to modern fiberglass, minus the itchy side effects unless you counted fleas. For the quirky tidbit, some huts had pits dug slightly below ground level, which helped regulate temperature. Warm air sank into the living space, and cold winds skimmed over the roof. Think of it as a medieval basement apartment, except your neighbors were chickens. And speaking of chickens, we'll get to that little heating trick later. Yes, the feathered furnace myth actually has truth to it. Now, here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether peasants intentionally engineered these huts for warmth, or if the insulation benefits were just happy accidents of cheap materials. Some claim peasants lacked architectural foresight and simply used what was on hand. Others argue that generations of trial and error honed these building methods into clever, deliberate survival strategies. The argument is a bit like wondering whether your grandma's chicken soup is science or magic. It works either way, so why quibble? Of course, huts weren't perfect. The smoke from the central hearth often had no chimney to escape through, so it lingered under the rafters. Imagine falling asleep while your eyes burned and your lungs filled with wood smoke. On the bright side, that smoke also killed off pests hiding in the thatch. You got warmth, fumigation, and watery eyes in one package. Modern air purifiers eat your heart out. Now, time for our 3 jokes to lighten the frost. First, medieval huts had open floor plans centuries before HGTV made them trendy, except their version came with pigs wandering through the kitchen. Second, if you think your landlord is bad, remember that a medieval landlord literally owned the walls, the roof, and sometimes the air you breathed. Third, those thatch roofs were home to birds and insects, so falling asleep to the sound of chirping wasn't romantic. It was your ceiling having roommates. So here's the punchline. Huts may have looked like flimsy boxes from the outside, but inside they worked as crude but effective insulation chambers. You weren't living in a palace, sure, but you weren't a popsicle either. Next time you complain about drafty windows, imagine sealing them with cow dung. Suddenly, weather stripping tape seems like a blessing, doesn't it? You've probably heard the old saying that medieval peasants slept on a bed of straw, and it sounds downright miserable. The myth paints a picture of people tossing and turning on scratchy stalks, itchy hay poking through thin linens, and clouds of dust puffing up every time you shifted. In your imagination, it's less bedtime bliss and more allergy attack. And let's not forget the fleas. According to the cliché, straw beds were practically the Airbnb for vermin. Makes you want to scratch your leg just thinking about it, doesn't it? But here comes the flip. Straw beds weren't just random piles of hay. They were carefully arranged, sometimes stuffed into coarse linen sacks called ticks. More importantly, straw gave off a surprising bonus heat. As it slowly decomposed, straw released a gentle warmth, almost like a primitive heated mattress. You weren't just lying on a bed. You were lying on a slow-motion compost pile that doubled as a radiator. Comfort, questionable. Survival, absolutely. Let's dig into the proof. Mainstream historical fact. Inventories from medieval estates mention bedstraw as a common household item, replaced seasonally. That means straw beds were not a one-time affair. They were maintained, cleaned out, and renewed, suggesting people actually cared about the quality. They didn't want to sleep in rotting mush any more than you do. For the quirky tidbit, in some cases, peasants mixed straw with aromatic herbs like lavender, mint, or wormwood to repel bugs and add a pleasant smell. Imagine drifting off to sleep in your scratchy straw sack, but with a whiff of medieval Febreze bonus. Wormwood supposedly drove away lice, though if it didn't, you just got lice with a minty aroma. Now for the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how much warmth these straw beds actually produced. Some claim the heat was negligible, and peasants relied more on body warmth and layers of blankets. Others argue that composting straw generated enough ambient heat to make a real difference, especially in enclosed huts. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Either way, if you ever fall asleep on a pile of autumn leaves, just tell yourself you're testing medieval technology. Of course, straw beds had their downsides. After a few weeks, the straw compacted into lumpy mats that felt more like sleeping on cardboard. You had to fluff, turn, or replace it regularly. Fail to do that, and you'd wake up with a crick in your back and a few new six-legged roommates. Imagine waking up mid-dream and realizing that tickle on your foot isn't your imagination, it's an actual tick. Sweet dreams, right? Now for the humor. 3 quick jokes to keep your blanket warm. First, medieval straw mattresses were the original memory foam. They remembered every single bump, lump, and flea. Second, if you sneezed 3 times in a row, chances were you weren't sick, you were just inhaling your bed. Third, peasants probably coined the phrase, "Don't let the bedbugs bite," and meant it literally. So what's the punchline? Straw beds weren't luxurious, but they weren't torture devices either. They provided insulation, some gentle heat, and even a bit of medieval aromatherapy if you were lucky. Yes, you might wake up itchy, but you'd wake up alive. Next time your mattress feels saggy, just remember you could be sleeping on rotting plants. Suddenly, that lumpy spring doesn't seem so bad, does it? The myth is simple and bleak. Peasants went to bed in icy silence, huddled under their rags, too cold and too exhausted to do anything but suffer through the night. Imagine it, everyone, wrapped up like human burritos, staring at the thatch, waiting for the sweet release of sunrise. It sounds depressing, doesn't it? Like winter turned every night into a prison sentence. But here's the flip. Medieval nights were often far more social and far warmer than we imagine. Instead of freezing in silence, families and neighbors sometimes shared not just gossip and stories, but also their body heat. That's right, talking, laughing, and snuggling quite literally raised the temperature of the room. Mainstream historical fact. Anthropologists note that in many traditional peasant households across Europe, communal sleeping was the norm. Families piled into shared beds, with parents, children, and sometimes even servants pressed together. It wasn't just about affection, it was a practical heat strategy. More bodies meant more warmth, and medieval people weren't too squeamish about personal space when frostbite was on the line. Quirky tidbit. Some records describe travelers or strangers sharing beds in inns not because of romance, but because it was the only way to keep warm. Picture yourself wandering into a medieval inn and the innkeeper says, "Sure, we've got a bed, but you'll be sharing it with 3 other guys. Don't worry, they only snore a little." Instant sleepover, whether you liked it or not. Now for the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how much of this communal sleeping was cultural choice versus sheer necessity. Some argue that people genuinely valued the intimacy and storytelling that came with shared sleep. Others believe it was tolerated only because it kept people alive, the equivalent of huddling with strangers at a bus stop during a snowstorm. Was it cozy tradition or desperate survival? Historians still haven't fully agreed, and here's where chatter mattered. Night was one of the few times peasants could relax, swap stories, and even sing quietly before drifting off. Talking didn't just pass the time, it psychologically dulled the sense of cold. Think about it. Ever sat around a campfire telling ghost stories? You almost forget how chilly it is until someone points it out. Same principle, except their campfire was a smoky ember and their marshmallows were non-existent. Now for the jokes 3 to warm things up. First, medieval bedtime stories weren't optional. If Grandpa started telling one, you had no escape unless you wanted to freeze on the floor. Second, sleeping with the whole family in one bed made for awkward mornings. Whose foot is that? Don't ask. Third, today we call it cozy winter cabin vibes. Back then, they called it Tuesday. And let's not forget the math of body heat. Modern studies suggest a human body at rest emits about 100 watts of heat. Stack a family of 5 into one bed, and you're generating enough warmth to power a light bulb all night. Not enough to charge your phone, but enough to stop your toes from turning blue. So here's the punchline. Peasants didn't just survive the cold by grit alone, they survived by snuggling, chatting, and turning bedtime into the medieval version of a podcast. Your modern bed might be warm, but admit it, sometimes you'd trade your weighted blanket for a little laughter and company. Unless, of course, you snore, then you'd be the one pushed to the cold side of the mattress. The myth is grim and simple. Medieval peasants froze in silence, huddled under whatever scraps of fabric they had, lying still in the darkness, as if the night itself had locked them in an icy tomb. You probably imagine them curled up alone on straw mats, unable to move or speak, because conserving energy was all they could do. The way the story is often told, winter nights were nothing but long stretches of suffering, the only soundtrack being the wind howling through the cracks in their huts. It's a powerful image, and it fits the stereotype of the Middle Ages as an endless grind of misery. But like so many myths, it's not the whole story. Here comes the flip. Peasants didn't always freeze in silence. In fact, medieval nights could be surprisingly lively, social, and most importantly warmer than you'd think. Far from lying rigid and quiet, families and even whole households used noise, storytelling, and sheer proximity to generate warmth. Your modern memory foam mattress may hug you individually, but their mattresses hugged entire families. Here's the historical core of the truth. Anthropologists and medieval records both indicate that communal sleeping was standard. Families, often large ones, piled into the same bed or slept shoulder to shoulder on mats. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, and occasionally even visitors, everyone together. It wasn't just out of love or poverty. It was pure thermal efficiency. A single person might radiate about 100 watts of heat while asleep. Put 6 people under one woolen cover, and suddenly you're the medieval equivalent of a small space heater. Let's start with our mainstream historical fact. Records from households in England and France mention great beds designed for multiple sleepers. And in inns, travelers were often assigned to share beds with strangers. The practice was so common that it barely raised eyebrows. The logic was simple: more bodies, more heat, less chance of waking up with your toes frozen. Now for the quirky tidbit. Sometimes peasants went beyond just piling bodies together. They actually invited animals into the mix. Chickens, dogs, even lambs occasionally shared sleeping spaces with their owners. Imagine waking up with a rooster perched on your blanket like an alarm clock with feathers. While we'll explore animals more deeply later, the point stands. Warmth was communal, and it wasn't silent. Snoring, clucking, and whispering were part of the nighttime soundscape. As for scholarly debate, historians still argue whether communal sleeping was embraced for intimacy and cultural bonding, or tolerated grudgingly as a survival tactic. Some suggest that families valued the stories, songs, and even lullabies that were shared during these long nights. Others think people endured it because no one wanted to die of hypothermia alone. Was it comfort, necessity, or both? The debate continues, but silence, hardly. People often spent the first hours of the night talking. Storytelling was a way to distract from hunger, from cold, and from boredom. Think of it like the medieval podcast before SleepX. Your hosts were family members, sitting right next to you, reciting tales passed down for generations. Some accounts even describe neighbors or visitors gathering in a single hut to talk until the embers dimmed. Far from eerie silence, there was chatter, gossip, and the occasional argument about who was hogging the blanket. Now, let's lighten the frost with 3 quick jokes. First, medieval bedtime stories weren't optional entertainment. Your grandfather started reciting a tale. You had to listen, unless you were willing to sleep outside with the pigs. Second, in a bed shared by half a dozen people, the phrase, "Whose foot is that?" probably came up every night. Third, today, people pay extra for cozy cabin retreats. Back then, peasants already had the package deal, minus the hot cocoa. Another thing rarely mentioned: laughter creates warmth, not just socially, but physically. When you laugh, your body generates a bit more heat. Families who joked or sang together before bed were literally helping themselves stay warm. This wasn't silence, it was survival disguised as entertainment. There's also the fascinating phenomenon of first sleep and second sleep. Many medieval people didn't sleep in one long stretch like we do today. Instead, they had 2 sleep phases, with a wakeful period in between, often lasting an hour or 2. During this time, people prayed, told stories, even got small chores done. Imagine waking at midnight, chatting with your family, then dozing back off until dawn. Those wakeful hours were social, and they also stirred up the shared warmth before everyone resettled. But of course, sleeping with so many people came with downsides. Snoring, coughing, fidgeting, all magnified by the lack of space. You might be warm, but you were also guaranteed to be annoyed. Picture it. You're finally drifting off, cozy at last, when your little brother elbows you in the ribs, or the neighbor's kid kicks you in the shin. Warmth achieved, peace denied. Let's add 3 more jokes, because this section is already crowded just like a medieval bed. First, they basically invented family-size beds before mattress companies thought of it, but without the adjustable firmness option. Second, if you think your roommate's alarm clock is annoying, try living with an actual rooster indoors. Third, medieval bedtime arguments probably sounded just like modern ones. Stop stealing the blanket. I'm not, you're just cold-blooded. So, the punchline. Peasants didn't suffer in frozen silence. They survived by filling the night with bodies, stories, and noise. Their huts became buzzing cocoons of heat and chatter. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Next time you pull your blanket up tight and enjoy the quiet hum of your fan, remember, your medieval counterpart had warmth just with a soundtrack of snores, whispers, and the occasional goat bleating in the corner. The myth paints a pretty icy picture. Medieval huts with wide, gaping holes pretending to be windows, icy drafts pouring in, snowflakes drifting across sleeping peasants like a free indoor snow globe. You might even imagine them waking up with frost on their eyebrows because their windows were just empty gaps cut into mud walls. The phrase "hole in the wall" wasn't just a metaphor, it was literal. And with that image, you might wonder, how on earth did anyone survive the endless drafts of winter nights? Here's the flip. Medieval peasants weren't clueless about the cold sneaking in through openings. Windows existed, yes, but they were small, narrow, and often covered with clever makeshift barriers. Sometimes it was oiled parchment translucent, enough to let in dim light, but dense enough to block wind. Sometimes it was wooden shutters, closed tight as the sun set. In the poorest huts, people stuffed gaps with rags, animal hides, or even bundles of straw. They may not have had double glazing, but they certainly didn't just sit there while the night air blasted through. Mainstream historical fact. Accounts from 13th–14th century manorial surveys describe peasant houses with shutters of wood and parchment panes. Glass was rare and expensive, reserved for churches or noble estates. For everyday villagers, parchment windows did the job, crinkly, greasy, and smelling faintly of sheep, but better than nothing. Think of it as medieval cling film. Quirky tidbit. In some parts of Northern Europe, windows weren't windows at all. They were simply holes stopped up with animal bladders. Imagine falling asleep under the eerie glow of moonlight shining through a pig's bladder. Romantic, not quite effective. Strangely, yes, it's probably the closest thing they had to a frosted bathroom window. As for scholarly debate, historians argue about just how common window coverings were in the poorest homes. Some insist that the poorest peasants relied entirely on shutters and darkness, never wasting parchment or animal products on light. Others counter with archaeological finds that suggest even modest huts made efforts to block drafts. Was every hut patched against the cold, or did some really suffer with bare openings? Historians still argue whether we're overestimating medieval ingenuity or underestimating medieval discomfort. But the point remains, peasants weren't as helpless as the myth makes them. They lived in the same climate we do, and their survival depended on using every scrap wisely. Oiled parchment might not sound glamorous, but it trapped warm air just enough to stop deadly drafts. And while you might complain about condensation on your modern windows, imagine the joy of simply not having your blanket blown off by midnight winds. Time for our 3 warming jokes. First, medieval parchment windows weren't great for privacy. If someone pressed their face up against the outside, you'd see a blurry ghost version of them, like a medieval horror filter. Second, if you thought cleaning modern windows was annoying, try scraping soot off stretched cowhide. Third, Instagram influencers posting window views from their huts would have been pretty underwhelming. Asterisk. Here's my pig bladder window, like and subscribe. But here's something else fun. Shutters weren't just for warmth, they were for security too. Closing a heavy wooden board over the opening meant animals, thieves, or the occasional drunk villager couldn't wander in. Imagine explaining to your kids, lock the shutters or the chickens might get in again. You didn't just block the wind, you blocked the neighborhood roosters' late-night visits. There's also the psychological effect. A closed window, however makeshift, created a sense of safety. The outside world stayed out, and the family cocooned themselves inside, listening to the muffled wind instead of feeling it in their bones. Even if the material was thin, the barrier mattered. It turned a hut into a home. And let's not forget the sound factor. Straw, hides, or wooden planks deadened the howling of the wind, which meant sleep was more possible. Imagine trying to drift off with constant winter gusts whistling through cracks at your head. Shutters weren't just physical shields, they were noise-canceling headphones, medieval edition. Now, let's expand with 3 more light jokes for good measure. First, if your window was covered with parchment, every rainstorm turned it into the world's worst drum set. Second, medieval kids probably drew on the shutters the way kids now draw on fogged car windows, except their parents couldn't just wipe it clean. Third, if you cracked your shutter open at night, you weren't stargazing. You were basically freezer testing your hut. The punchline: windows weren't gaping holes of misery. They were patched, sealed, and improvised with whatever peasants could find. Drafts existed, sure, but people fought them with ingenuity that kept huts just warm enough to keep death at bay. So next time you double-paned city dwellers complain about the heating bill, remember, you could be sealing your windows with sheep guts. Suddenly, thermostat wars don't seem so bad, do they? The myth goes like this: wool was a luxury only the wealthy could afford, leaving peasants shivering in linen rags, while noble lords strutted around in plush wool cloaks. The story paints the poor as doomed to freeze simply because they lacked access to sheep, spinning wheels, and nice blankets. It's an image that fits neatly with the idea of the Middle Ages as brutally unequal. Rich wrapped in cozy fleece, poor left to suffer. But here's the flip. Wool wasn't just for elites. Peasants had their ways of spinning, weaving, and patching together warm clothing from the scraps available to them. Sure, they didn't have the thick, richly dyed cloaks you see in illuminated manuscripts, but coarse wool garments, sometimes scratchy, sometimes patched together from older fabric, were common enough that they formed the backbone of peasant winterwear. Even the poorest huts often had some kind of woolen blanket, cloak, or cap. Mainstream historical fact: by the 12th century, England's wool trade was booming, and even peasants who couldn't afford fine cloth often had access to coarser, locally spun wool. Archaeological finds of spindle-whorl small tools used to spin wool by hand are common in peasant dwellings. This shows that families were spinning their own thread and weaving it into basic garments. They may not have had wardrobes full of options, but they weren't naked under the stars either. Quirky tidbit: some peasants reused every scrap of wool until it was nearly unrecognizable. Worn-out garments were felted, pressed, and shrunk into denser cloth, fanned, turned into blankets or padding. Even old wool caps could be unraveled. The yarn spun again and rewoven into new shapes. Talk about recycling. Medieval peasants were centuries ahead of the sustainability movement. Imagine them watching you throw away an old sweater they'd faint from the wastefulness. And then there's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how much wool peasants really wore compared to linen. Linen was cheaper and widely available, especially in summer. But winter demanded heavier fabric, and wool was the natural choice. Some argue that peasants relied mostly on linen layered with fur scraps, while others maintain that wool was a staple even for the poor. The truth likely varied by region. Colder climates pushed even the poorest families to prioritize wool, while milder areas leaned more on lighter fabric. Now, let's bring in the humor 3 woolly jokes to keep things warm. First, peasants knew the struggle of itchy sweaters long before your grandma's knitting needles. Second, if you think laundry day is bad, try washing wool by hand in icy water. It shrank faster than your will to live. Third, sheep were basically walking clothing racks, and peasants probably looked at them the way you look at your winter coat in the closet. Not yet, but soon. But wool wasn't just for clothes. It showed up in bedding, caps, mittens, and even socks. Yes, socks, though not in the fancy department store sense. Some were crudely knitted or felted into tubes, stuffed with extra fabric to pad against cold floors. Not cozy, but when you're trying to avoid frostbite, fashion takes a back seat. Wool was also surprisingly versatile. Thin wool layers could wick away moisture, while thick felted wool trapped heat. Families layered garments strategically, linen undergarments to protect the skin, then coarse wool tunics, then cloaks or blankets over the top. Even head coverings, matterda, wool cap, or hood kept more heat in than you'd expect. Ever wonder why so many medieval illustrations show peasants with hoods? It wasn't just fashion, it was survival. And here's something modern, folks. Forget dyeing wasn't a priority for peasants. Clothes often came in natural shades, browns, grays, off-whites. That meant patchwork garments looked like earthy quilts, one sleeve darker than the other. Totally normal. Imagine walking into a medieval village fashion show. Tonight's look is 5 shades of sheep. Time for another round of jokes. First, peasants probably invented the phrase make do and mend because fast fashion meant how quickly your cloak fell apart. Second, wearing coarse wool all winter gave everyone a permanent, scratchy, rash medieval skincare tip. Ignore it. Third, if you were lucky enough to have a whole wool cloak, you basically owned the medieval equivalent of a luxury SUV. So what's the punchline? Wool wasn't a luxury locked away for nobles. It was a patchy, itchy, but life-saving material that even peasants worked into their lives. They spun scraps, recycled old garments, and wore mismatched layers until they resembled walking patchwork quilts. Sure, you might laugh at their fashion sense, but when the wind howled through the hut, they were laughing last warm enough to sleep another night. The myth says that medieval nights were deadly still. You picture silence blanketing the village, only the wind rattling through the thatch, while peasants tried to keep their teeth from chattering. The only company, darkness, cold, and the creeping dread that the night might never end. If you were unlucky, you might imagine yourself lying awake, counting the hours until sunrise, while slowly becoming an icicle. Sounds terrifying, doesn't it? But here's the flip. Medieval huts weren't silent tombs. In fact, they were lively, noisy, and believe it or not, yes, animals, dogs, jokes, chickens, even the occasional cow often shared space with the humans. These furry heaters were part of the peasant survival strategy. You didn't just eat your livestock. Sometimes you literally slept with it. The warmth radiating from a living, breathing creature could mean the difference between a bitter, sleepless night and a tolerable one. Mainstream historical fact, manorial records, and agricultural texts note that many peasant homes were byres, meaning they combined human and animal quarters under one roof. The animals weren't simply outside in barns, they were integrated into the home. A cow in the next room, or even the same room, wasn't unusual. Their body heat warmed the air, and their presence added a little extra insulation. It might sound gross, but it worked. Now for the quirky tidbit. Chickens weren't just alarm clocks with feathers. They were also bedtime companions. In some regions, people kept hens under benches or in lofts above sleeping areas, where their warmth trickled down. Imagine drifting off to sleep with the gentle clucking of hens and the faint smell of feathers. Who needs white noise machines when you have poultry? And of course, there's a scholarly debate. Historians still argue how deliberate this arrangement was. Did peasants truly plan to use animals as heaters, or was it simply convenience? Some argue that livestock were kept indoors to prevent theft and wolves, with warmth as a bonus. Others maintain that warmth was the main benefit, especially in harsher climates. The jury's still out. Was it survival engineering, or just multitasking? Now, before you cringe too hard, think about modern comparisons. Ever had a dog climb into bed with you on a cold night? You know how much heat they throw off. Multiply that by goats or cows nearby, and suddenly your hut feels less like a freezer and more like a crowded, smelly blanket fort. Not glamorous, but survival rarely is. Let's add our 3 light jokes to keep the barnyard vibe alive. First, medieval kids didn't ask for puppies, they asked for calves, because that was the ultimate heated blanket. Second, if you thought your roommate was noisy, try sharing a bedroom with a rooster who thinks 3 a.m. is sunrise. Third, the phrase farm-tootable took on a whole new meaning when your dinner was literally standing beside your bed. But there's more. Having animals indoors didn't just mean warm, it meant activity. The shuffling of hooves, the rustling of feathers, the occasional bleat nights were filled with sound. Silence was rare. Peasants were surrounded by the living rhythms of their animals, which probably gave a strange sort of comfort. Imagine lying in bed, half asleep, hearing your cow shift nearby, and thinking, well, at least we're both not freezing. And animals created another effect. Humidity, breathing, sweating, and waste all released moisture into the hut's air, reducing the bite of the cold. Was it pleasant? Not exactly. Was it useful? Definitely. Historians note that the smell of medieval huts was unforgettable, but so was the resilience of the families inside. For fun, here are 3 more jokes to round out the warmth. First, medieval peasants invented the original heated mattress padded just mood. Second, try explaining to a medieval villager that in 2025 people buy pet heating pads. They'd laugh and point at their goat. Third, medieval lullabies probably had to compete with the barnyard chorus. Sleep tight, don't mind the chickens pecking at your toes. The punchline: medieval nights weren't silent and they weren't empty. They were filled with the warmth and noise of animals, turning huts into living, breathing ecosystems. It might not sound like the cozy winter cabin of your dreams, but for peasants, it was survival wrapped in wool feathers and fur. So next time your dog hogs the blanket, remember you're reenacting a medieval tradition, minus the goat in the corner. The myth is a cold one. Medieval huts had zero insulation. According to the popular image, peasants lived inside glorified sheds walls of sticks and gaps that let icy winds whistle right through. You picture families lying under thin blankets, their breath fogging in the air as frost crept along the inside walls. The idea is that huts were nothing more than shelters in name only, useless against the cold. Might as well sleep under a bridge, right? But here's the flip. Those huts weren't as flimsy as the myth suggests. Peasants used clever building methods to create natural insulation out of the simplest, cheapest materials available: wattle, daub, clay, and even dung. Far from empty shells, their homes were patched, sealed, and thickened to keep warmth in and cold out. They might not pass modern building codes, but they did the job well enough to get families through brutal winters. Mainstream historical fact: wattle and daub construction was the backbone of peasant housing. Thin branches were woven together. The wattle, then packed with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and animal dung, the daub. When it dried, it hardened into walls that were surprisingly sturdy and insulating. Archaeological digs in England, France, and Germany have revealed daub remnants that lasted centuries, still clinging to wooden frames long after the families were gone. Here's the quirky tidbit: animal dung wasn't just filler, it added fibers and binding agents that made the walls stronger and less likely to crack. In some villages, people preferred cow dung because it produced a smoother finish. Imagine explaining to your kids, "No, don't track mud inside, save it for the walls." It wasn't just waste, it was construction material. And, as gross as it sounds, dung also repelled pests when mixed with clay, so your walls doubled as bug deterrents. Now, the scholarly debate: historians still argue whether these huts were truly warm or just less freezing. Some studies suggest that daubed walls insulated about as well as modern plywood, which, when combined with low ceilings and central hearths, created tolerable conditions. Others argue that the walls cracked easily and drafts remained a constant issue. Was it snug survival or drafty compromise? The argument continues, with no single answer fitting every village or region. But the logic is clear: insulation mattered. Even the poorest peasants couldn't afford to ignore the cold, so they innovated with what they had. Mud and dung may not sound glamorous, but they trapped heat, absorbed moisture, and kept huts from collapsing in on themselves. It's not romantic, but it's survival architecture. Now, for our 3 light jokes about medieval home improvement. First, peasants basically invented DIY long before YouTube tutorials, except theirs started with step 1, collect dung. Second, if you thought your neighbor's house smelled strange, try walking past a fresh daub hut on a summer afternoon. Third, peasants didn't argue over paint colors. They argued over whose cow produced the best wall paste. Insulation wasn't just about walls either. Roofs were thick thatch bundles of reeds, layered so densely that rain slid off and warm air stayed trapped beneath. Properly maintained thatch roofs could last decades, and they were excellent at muffling both cold winds and noise. The catch? They also made excellent nesting sites for mice and birds, so your ceiling was occasionally alive. Still, better a squeaky mouse overhead than a freezing draft at your feet. Floors played their part too. Many huts had simple beaten earth floors, but peasants layered straw or rushes across them. This provided a kind of natural carpeting, insulating against the chill of the ground. The rushes absorbed dirt and waste, and they were swapped out regularly. Picture it as the medieval version of wall-to-wall carpeting, disposable, organic, and guaranteed to smell funky after a while. Let's throw in 3 more jokes, because why not warm the mood? First, rush flooring was basically the first biodegradable carpet. You didn't vacuum it, you shoveled it out. Second, if medieval peasants had Yelp, their hut reviews would read, "Smells weird, but surprisingly warm." Third, Home Depot would have gone bankrupt in the Middle Ages. Hood pay for lumber when mud and cow patties were free. There's also the layering effect. Thick walls, thatch roof. Was it toasty? No, but it was survivable, which is exactly what mattered. The huts weren't castles, but they were engineered ecosystems designed to fight the cold with every scrap available. And don't underestimate community maintenance. Families patched cracks constantly, stuffing them with fresh daub. Winter wasn't just about surviving, it was about daily upkeep, plugging gaps before the next storm rolled in. Imagine your to-do list: milk cow, harvest wood, redub wall. Before the wind blows my blanket away. The punchline: peasants didn't live in hollow shells. Their huts were Madon-dung fortresses, patched and layered until they could hold warmth like a primitive thermos. Next time you complain about poor insulation in your apartment, remember you could be slapping cow dung on your walls to keep warm. Suddenly, drafty windows don't sound so bad. The myth is stark. Peasants slept alone in the cold. Each person huddled in a separate corner of the hut, shivering through endless nights. Picture a lonely figure curled up on a straw mat, wrapped in a thin blanket, while icy drafts crept over their body. The silence is heavy, the chill unbearable, and you're left imagining that every peasant went to bed each night with the quiet dread of not waking up in the morning. Solitary, miserable, frozen, that's the picture. But here's the flip. Peasants rarely slept alone. They didn't think of sleeping as a private individual act the way many of us do today. For them, sleep was communal. Families, neighbors, even visitors, often piled together in one bed or across shared mats. Bed sharing wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. It created warmth, strengthened social bonds, and turned winter nights into survival by numbers. Forget personal space. In the medieval world, your best blanket was the body lying next to you. Mainstream historical fact, medieval court records, household inventories, and even travelers' accounts mention great beds that slept several people at once. Inns, in particular, placed total strangers together in the same bed. Diaries from the 15th century complain about having to share with snorers and stinkers, which tells us that the practice was so normal. The real problem wasn't bed sharing, it was bed manners. Here's the quirky tidbit. Families sometimes slept in deliberate patterns, almost like living jigsaw puzzles. Parents in the middle, children on the sides, babies tucked between older siblings, and maybe even a servant or grandparent at the foot. The arrangement maximized warmth and protection. Picture a human lasagna with layers of body heat stacked together. Cozy, maybe, awkward, definitely effective, without question. Now, the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether bed sharing was mostly about warmth or about culture. Some suggest peasants saw sleep as deeply communal, part of a rhythm of storytelling, prayer, and togetherness. Others think warmth was the only real motivator, and that if they'd had modern heating, everyone would have claimed their own space instantly. Was it cultural intimacy or pure survival logic? Historians still wrestle with the answer. Of course, this style of sleeping wasn't without issues. Snoring echoed in the small huts. Children fidgeted. Someone inevitably stole more blanket than their fair share. And yes, hygiene was questionable. Sharing space meant sharing lice, fleas, and the occasional nighttime accident. It wasn't glamorous, but the benefits outweighed the discomfort. You could grumble about Uncle Thomas's snoring all you wanted. At least you weren't freezing to death. Let's keep it warm with 3 jokes. First, medieval bed sharing was the original family plan, but instead of cheaper phone bills, you just got warmer toes. Second, if you thought today's bed hog is bad, try fighting your grandmother for blanket rights. Third, whispering secrets before falling asleep wasn't just fun, it was insurance that everyone was still alive and breathing. There's also something oddly psychological about communal sleep. People felt safer surrounded by others. In a world where wolves howled outside, bandits lurked on roads, and disease hovered everywhere, being close together brought peace of mind. The cold wasn't the only danger. Loneliness was, too. Falling asleep next to someone was reassurance that you weren't facing the night alone. Add to this the phenomenon of segmented sleep we touched on earlier. First sleep and second sleep. During the wakeful hours in between, people chatted quietly, prayed, or even got up to tend the fire. Bed sharing meant you had a built-in company during these midnight interludes. No endless doom scrolling on a phone, just whispered conversations in the dark. It was the medieval version of late-night texting, except the person was literally inches away. And don't forget the emotional bonds that grew out of this. Siblings who might bicker by day had to press together for warmth by night. Parents could keep infants safe and warm against their own bodies. Even guests or strangers found unexpected companionship in the forced intimacy of sharing a mattress. The line between survival, necessity, and cultural closeness blurred every single night. Let's sprinkle in 3 more jokes because this section practically begs for them. First, medieval people didn't need weighted blankets. They had the crushing weight of 3 siblings piled on top. Second, saying sleep tight had real meaning when you were squeezed so close you couldn't move an inch. Third, bed sharing was like a medieval trust fall. You just had to believe the person beside you wasn't secretly a blanket thief. So what's the punchline? Peasants didn't sleep alone and shiver. They survived by sleeping together, pressed close, stories whispered in the dark, warmth shared like currency. Their huts were filled with human heat, messy but effective. Next time you stretch out luxuriously in your own bed, think about how radical that privacy would have seemed. 700 years ago, in their world, survival was found not in solitude, but in the tangle of shared blankets and borrowed warmth. The myth goes like this: cold air was the enemy of health. People in the Middle Ages supposedly believed that if you slept in the cold, your immune system would crumble, sickness would sweep in, and you'd wake up one sneeze away from the plague. You've probably heard your own grandmother say something similar: bundle up or you'll catch your death of cold. That idea feels timeless, that winter itself makes you sick, that drafts are deadly, and that peasants spent their nights battling invisible illness along with the frost. But here's the flip: cold air didn't doom peasants. In fact, in some ways, it may have helped them. The medieval mindset toward air, what they called miasma, was complicated. Yes, people feared bad air-carrying disease, but they also valued fresh breezes as cleansing and purifying. Sleeping in a smoky hut sealed too tightly wasn't necessarily healthier than one with a few drafts. Ironically, those same cracks and holes that let in icy air may have reduced bacteria and pest buildup. Cold nights didn't automatically mean weak immune systems. They may have been survival hacks in disguise. Mainstream historical fact, writings from medieval physicians such as Hildegard of Bingen, and texts like the *regimen sanitatis salernitinum* emphasized balanced smoky air indoors could be harmful, while clean outdoor air was sometimes prescribed as a remedy. In other words, too much sealed heat was considered unhealthy, especially in winter when huts filled with smoke. Even peasants, without medical training, sensed that a little ventilation was better than choking on soot all night. Quirky tidbit: in some regions, people deliberately cracked shutters or left gaps for air circulation, even in winter. The idea wasn't to freeze themselves, it was to keep the hut from suffocating. Imagine that, peasants practicing a kind of medieval air purifier, except their purifier was just the wind, a little draft, a little cough, and maybe fewer bugs. Not the coziest trade-off, but it might have saved lives. Now, here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether exposure to cold air made peasants more vulnerable to illness, or whether it toughened them up. Some argue that constant exposure to cold suppressed the immune system, leaving people more vulnerable to disease. Others suggest that constant micro-exposures hardened their resilience. The same way modern proponents of cold therapy argue that plunges into icy water boost immunity. Was the cold a killer or a conditioner? Scholars can't agree, and maybe both were true, depending on the circumstance. Let's warm this up with 3 jokes. First, medieval kids probably rolled their eyes when their mothers yelled, "Close the shutter, you'll catch your death." A timeless parental warning that never dies. Second, peasants didn't need trendy cryotherapy chambers. They had drafty huts with built-in wind tunnels. Third, modern gyms sell memberships for cold exposure classes, while peasants got them free every single night. It's also important to remember that immune system wasn't a concept medieval people had, but they observed patterns. They knew that smoky huts made people cough, while fresh air sometimes seemed to help. They believed illness came from corrupted air, so, ironically, the outside cold sometimes felt safer than stale warmth indoors. A child coughing in a hut thick with smoke might have been carried outside to breathe the chill, under the belief it could restore balance. Was it scientific? Not by modern standards. Did it occasionally work? Quite possibly. But let's not romanticize the chill too much. Cold air didn't cure everything. People still fell ill in winter, and sometimes exposure did make things worse. Poor nutrition, damp clothing, and constant drafts could wear bodies down. That's why layering clothes, patching shutters, and piling together mattered so much. You wanted enough airflow to avoid suffocation, but not so much that your toes turned to ice. Balancing warmth and ventilation was its own kind of art form. Here are 3 more light jokes, because we need them while imagining smoky, drafty huts. First, medieval peasants basically invented open-plan living, but their version came with bonus pneumonia. Second, if you complained about drafts, your family probably told you to just snuggle closer to the goat. Third, in their world, seasonal sniffles weren't cured with cough syrup. They were cured with another layer of scratchy wool. There's also something worth considering. Parasites and microbes thrived in warm, sealed environments. Cold slowed them down. Some historians suggest that those icy drafts may have kept infestations, fleas, lice, bacteria, little less overwhelming. Sleeping in a chill might have meant fewer itchy nights, even if your nose dripped. A strange silver lining to discomfort. Think, too, of the cultural wisdom that came with experience. Generations of peasants knew what worked, which parts of the hut to patch, and which to leave cracked. They didn't need thermometers, they had trial and error. And the fact that people survived century after century proves they figured out just enough balance between warmth and air to keep going. The punchline. Cold air didn't mean inevitable weakness. It meant resilience, adaptation, and an ongoing dance between freezing winds and smoky suffocation. Medieval peasants didn't live in a sterile, climate-controlled bubble. They lived in huts where every breeze, every ember, every crack in the wall shaped their health. And while you wrap yourself in 3 blankets and complain about your thermostat, remember, sometimes a little draft was their lifesaver, not their doom. The myth runs like this: poor medieval peasants never enjoyed warm drinks. You imagine them trudging back to their huts after a long day in the fields, collapsing on their straw beds with nothing but cold water or sour ale to sip before shivering through the night. The picture is bleak. No hot chocolate, no steaming tea, not even a bowl of broth, just endless cold, both outside and inside, like punishment baked into their very diet. But here's the flip. Peasants actually did have warm drinks and simmering concoctions that helped them get through long winter nights. They didn't call it bedtime tea, but hot brews, whether made from herbs, spiced ale, or simple warmed milk, were part of the medieval survival toolkit. Think of it less as Starbucks and more as the world's first DIY bedtime latte. Cheap ingredients, slow simmer, maximum warmth, mainstream historical fact, recipes from medieval household guides and medical texts, reference hot possets and coddles, mixtures of warm milk, honey, oats, or wine, often thickened with egg. While nobles may have had richer versions, even peasants brewed their simpler counterparts. Warm ale or cider was common, sometimes spiced with whatever herbs grew nearby. These drinks weren't just luxuries, they were comfort in liquid form, helping bodies fight the cold before bed. Quirky tidbit: one favorite drink for peasants was called pottage ale, essentially warmed beer thickened with bread or grains. Imagine dunking stale bread into hot ale until it turned into mush and calling it supper. Not exactly a pumpkin spice latte, but hey, it filled your belly, warmed your body, and kept you from freezing. For kids or those avoiding alcohol, hot milk flavored with herbs like fennel or mint served the same purpose. Herbal teas weren't exotic imports, they were literally garden weeds boiled in water. Now, the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how widespread hot drinks were among the poorest of peasants. Some believe they were occasional treats, made when extra firewood or ingredients were available. Others argue they were nightly staples in colder months, because even a tiny ember could heat a clay pot. Was it a regular ritual or an occasional indulgence? The debate continues, though archaeological evidence of soot-stained pottery suggests peasants warmed liquid far more often than the myth admits. Let's stir in our first 3 jokes. First, medieval hot drinks were so thick with bread chunks you practically needed a spoonstop. Books would have sold it as Elicino. Second, peasants didn't need fancy latte art. Their foam was just boiled over milk scum. Third, instead of caramel drizzle, their topping was a lucky bit of oat husk floating in the cup. But beyond comedy, warm drinks played a real role in survival. Heat from inside mattered. When you drink something hot, your core body temperature rises, circulation improves, and the shivering subsides. Modern science confirms this. Medieval peasants may not have had thermodynamics textbooks, but they had common sense and tradition. Warm liquid before bed meant fewer chills during sleep, and it wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Gathering around the hearth, however smoky, to share a steaming mug created a sense of ritual. For a few moments, you weren't just enduring the winter, you were taming it. The smell of herbs, the steam on your face, the simple comfort of holding a warm cup, it softened the edge of the night. Now for another round of jokes. First, if medieval peasants had cafe culture, it would have been one hut selling extra watery ale with straw seating. Second, ordering half-calf in a medieval tavern would have gotten you laughed out the door. Third, their loyalty card was the landlord letting you have your mug back unbroken. It's also worth noting that peasants used warm drinks medicinally. Hot brews with herbs like sage or chamomile were believed to aid sleep, soothe coughs, or even protect against evil spirits. While some of these claims were superstition, others had merit. Chamomile tea really does relax the body. So when a peasant child coughed in the night, a parent might heat a little herbal brew. Was it medicine or comfort? Both. The communal aspect matters too. Sharing a pot of hot ale or milk before bed wasn't just about warmth, it was about togetherness. Imagine a family sitting close to the hearth, sipping, telling stories, then finally retreating under blankets. That little moment of ritual eased the transition from the day's labor to the long, cold night. 3 final jokes to keep your cup steaming. First, medieval baristas didn't ask your name. They guessed it, yelled it wrong, and charged you extra bread. Second, peasants probably argued over who got the last mug, the same way we fight over the last cookie. Third, their idea of extra foam was just, oops, I dropped more bread in the punchline. Peasants weren't doomed to dry throats and icy gulps before bed. They had their own warm, rustic drinks that soothed, comforted, and fortified them against the cold. So next time you wrap your hands around a fancy chai latte, remember you're partaking in a tradition as old as mud huts and smoky fires. The only difference is your cup doesn't taste faintly of boiled oats. The myth says medieval peasants went to bed at nightfall and slept straight through until dawn, one long, unbroken block of slumber. You picture exhausted workers collapsing onto their straw mats, pulling their scratchy wool blankets over their heads, and vanishing into a coma until the rooster crowed. No interruptions, no shifts, just pure, uninterrupted sleep from sunset to sunrise. It sounds almost enviable compared to today's fractured nights of buzzing phones and midnight stress. But here's the flip. Peasants didn't sleep like we do, and they definitely didn't sleep in one solid stretch. In fact, their nights were often divided into 2 phases, first sleep and second sleep, separated by a wakeful period. In the middle of the night, that interlude wasn't a restless accident, it was part of their rhythm. And believe it or not, that segmented sleep helped keep them warmer. The myth of the long, dead night slumber crumbles when you realize peasants lived by the cycle of broken sleep, not the modern obsession with 8 hours straight. Mainstream historical fact. References to first and second sleep appear in diaries, court records, and literature throughout Europe well into the early modern period. Historian A. Roger Eckertch's work shows that first sleep often lasted a few hours after dusk, followed by 1 to 2 hours of wakefulness, and then second sleep until morning. Far from rare, this pattern was widespread and considered normal. Quirky tidbit. During the wakeful period, peasants didn't just lie in bed staring at the smoky ceiling. They prayed, talked, even did chores by the hearth. Some used the time for intimacy, believing the midnight hours were especially fertile. Others stoked the fire, stirred the embers, or adjusted bedding. Think of it as a scheduled midnight snack run, except instead of raiding the fridge, you were poking ash with a stick and sipping lukewarm ale. Here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep was universal or varied by season and region. Some claim it was primarily a winter phenomenon when long nights left too much time to fill. Others believe it was a year-round rhythm dictated by candlelight and work patterns. Was it the standard medieval sleep cycle, or just one of many options? Scholars disagree, but the evidence strongly suggests peasants in cold climates embraced it as practical routine. And here's where warmth comes in. Waking in the middle of the night allowed peasants to tend the fire, redistribute blankets, and snuggle closer together. It broke up the coldest, hardest stretch of the night. Imagine the hut growing chill after a few hours, the embers dying. Someone wakes, stirs the fire, adds a log, and suddenly the entire family warms again before second sleep. Far from weakness, segmented sleep was resilience in action. Let's warm the mood with 3 jokes. First, peasants didn't need insomnia. They scheduled it. Second, their version of Netflix and chill at midnight was literally poke the fire and hope it doesn't die. Third, if you got up in the middle of the night and stubbed your toe, at least 5 people groaned at once because you woke the whole bed pile. There's another psychological layer. That midnight wakefulness gave peasants time to reflect, pray, and talk quietly. In a world where daylight hours were consumed by labor, this nighttime pause offered rare space for intimacy and thought. Some even believed dreams from first sleep were prophetic, while second sleep brought ordinary dreams. Picture yourself lying under a smoky thatch roof, whispering with your family about visions from your dreams, while chickens shuffle in the rafters. Not so silent, not so simple. And don't forget body movement. Waking meant shifting, turning, and repositioning, small acts that generated warmth and circulation. Lying absolutely still all night in a cold hut could make limbs stiff and colder. Getting up to stir the fire or refluff straw beds actually kept bodies warmer. Unbroken sleep might sound nice, but in the Middle Ages, broken sleep was often safer. Let's add another 3 jokes to keep spirits up. First, peasants probably invented the midnight snack, though theirs was leftover oat mush instead of cookies. Second, their alarm clock wasn't digital, it was a goat bleating, to be milked early. Third, when they prayed during midnight hours, some probably also prayed that their neighbor would finally stop snoring. It's worth pointing out how alien this sounds to modern listeners. Today, insomnia is treated as a disorder, but medieval people expected to wake. The middle of the night wasn't feared, it was normal. That cultural difference reframes how we imagine their sleep. They didn't toss and turn with anxiety. They stretched, whispered, and waited for second sleep to carry them back into dreams. And in that sense, segmented sleep actually matched the environment. Long winter nights stretched 10 to 14 hours in Northern Europe. Sleeping straight through would have been nearly impossible, especially with the cold. Breaking it into phases, punctuated with fire tending and conversation, aligned human rhythms with survival. The punchline: peasants didn't lie in bed like frozen statues waiting for morning. They lived the night in segments, waking to stir fires, share whispers, and warm their bones before returning to slumber. Their broken nights weren't failures. They were ingenious adaptations to cold, darkness, and community. So next time you wake up at 2 a.m. and curse your insomnia, imagine you're just reenacting medieval survival tactics. You're not restless, you're historic. The myth is that everyone in the Middle Ages absolutely hated winter nights. You imagine peasants cursing the cold, dreading each sunset, and doing anything possible to escape the icy air. According to this picture, winter was pure misery, shivering, suffering, and waiting for spring like prisoners, marking days on a wall. The idea is simple: cold was the enemy, and no one could possibly find anything good about it. But here's the flip: not everyone despised the chill. Strange as it sounds, some peasants actually embraced winter cold with quirky traditions, rituals, and even celebrations. For many communities, winter wasn't just about endurance, it was a season woven with meaning. Cold nights brought opportunities for bonding, storytelling, and even playful customs. People didn't only grit their teeth against the frost, sometimes they laughed right through it. Mainstream historical fact: medieval festivals like Yule and Candlemas often celebrated light and warmth during the darkest months. Families gathered to feast, sing, and honor traditions that made winter nights less dreadful. The calendar itself was structured around these cold months, with holidays offering relief from endless toil. Cold wasn't just tolerated, it was ritualized. Quirky tidbit: some villages believed sleeping in the cold was spiritually cleansing. There are accounts of peasants deliberately cracking shutters to let frosty air chase out bad spirits. Others splashed cold water on their faces before bed as protection against nightmares. Imagine explaining to them that in 2025 people pay money for cold plunges. They'd grin knowingly and say, "We've been doing that for centuries, just without the fancy spas." Now, the scholarly debate: historians still argue whether peasants genuinely embraced cold, or if these traditions were simply coping mechanisms. Did people really find joy in frosty rituals, or did they dress them up as culture to distract from hardship? Some argue festivals were sincere celebrations of winter's beauty, while others see them as psychological armor-making, meaning out of misery. The truth is probably both. Humans are resilient. We survive by reframing hardship as ritual. And in practice, peasants sometimes used cold as opportunity. Frozen ponds meant skating or sliding games. Snowfall meant playful battles among children. Even adults joked about slipping on ice or shared tales of winter tricksters. Cold became part of the social fabric, something to laugh about rather than fear. The myth of universal hatred misses this nuance. Let's lighten the frost with 3 jokes. First, medieval snowball fights probably looked identical to today's, except someone inevitably threw a rock by accident. Second, when peasants made snow angels, it was probably just because they tripped carrying firewood. Third, their version of hot cocoa after sledding was a mug of lukewarm ale that tasted vaguely like bread. Another overlooked detail: the cold slowed agricultural work, which meant winter nights often gave peasants more leisure than summer. After endless months of dawn-to-dusk field labor, winter brought long evenings for rest, stories, music, and games. Cold didn't only punish, it also gifted time. Imagine a father strumming a crude instrument while the family laughed under blankets, their voices mixing with the wind outside. There's also something to be said about peasants lived in climates without modern heating, so their tolerance for cold was far greater than ours. What feels unbearable to us might have been routine to them. They adapted, not just physically, but mentally, joking about the cold, weaving traditions around it, and even exaggerating its dangers were ways to own the experience. Let's toss in another trio of jokes. First, medieval villagers who said "I love winter" were basically the original annoying friends posting snow selfies. Second, peasants probably bragged about who had the draftiest hut and still survived hardship as bragging rights. Third, if your neighbor complained about the chill, the standard reply was probably, "At least it keeps the fleas slow." These quirky traditions even shaped storytelling. Winter tales often featured frost giants, icy spirits, or clever peasants outwitting the cold. Stories turned freezing nights into entertainment. Instead of dreading every draft, people made them part of the imagination. You weren't just shivering, you were living alongside myths, and of course, faith tied into it. Churches taught that enduring hardship in winter was a form of spiritual strength. Suffering through the cold without complaint was seen as virtuous, almost purifying. Some peasants likely took pride in showing they could withstand the chill, turning survival itself into a moral badge. The punchline: not everyone hated the harsh cold. Some embraced it through quirky traditions, jokes, and rituals that turned misery into meaning. Winter nights weren't only battles against frost, they were canvases for culture, laughter, and resilience. So next time you hear someone say, "I actually like winter," don't roll your eyes, they're channeling their inner medieval peasant. The myth here is blunt. Survival in the Middle Ages was just luck. According to this view, peasants stumbled through winters with no real strategy, no real plans, chance. If the weather wasn't too brutal, if they happened to have enough food, if sickness didn't strike, they survived. If not, they froze. The myth makes it sound like medieval peasants were playing an endless, miserable lottery against the cold. But here's the flip. Survival wasn't blind. Luck. It was built on culture, community, and countless small hacks accumulated over generations. Peasants lived in harsh conditions, yes, but they didn't simply cross their fingers. They worked together, shared resources, and leaned on traditions that turned survival into something much closer to certainty. Mainstream historical fact: manorial records show communal obligations like firewood gathering days and shared threshing. These weren't random chores. They ensured that entire villages stockpiled fuel and food to endure the winter. Collective effort mattered more than chance. If one family's firewood pile dwindled, neighbors often pitched in. Winter wasn't every family for itself. It was a group project of survival. Quirky tidbit: some villages practiced bed rotation, where travelers or poorer families took turns sleeping in warmer homes. Especially if one household had a bigger hearth, it was less about hospitality and more about survival sharing. Imagine signing up for a nightly Airbnb, except the price was a story, a favor, or some bread. Now, for the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether peasants consciously planned all of this, or if traditions simply evolved without strategy. Was communal survival intentional or just habit? Some say people developed a peasant common sense that automatically prioritized group endurance. Others argue individuals were motivated more by self-preservation than by altruism, and helping neighbors was just insurance in case they needed help later. Was it generosity or reciprocity? Historians continue to wrestle with the answer, but the effect was real. Survival was structured, not random. Huts were sealed, beds layered, animals brought inside, warm drinks brewed, fires banked, and people piled together. The cultural memory of what worked carried communities through centuries of winters. What looks like luck to us was really the invisible scaffolding of tradition. Let's close the series with our final 3 jokes. First, if survival was luck, peasants would have bought lottery tickets with hay instead of coins. Second, the medieval motto wasn't live, love, love. It was patch, share, survive. Third, if peasants relied only on luck, every winter would have turned into a mass game of medieval freeze tag. The truth is, luck always plays some role in life, but peasants stacked the odds. They created systems of sharing, rituals, of endurance, and practical hacks that made winter survivable year after year. Their resilience wasn't blind fortune, it was the daily, gritty work of being human together. The punchline: medieval survival wasn't a dice roll. It was culture wrapped in wool. community sealed in mud, and tradition whispered in smoky huts. So when you slip under your blankets tonight, think about how much knowledge went into letting those long-ago families wake up alive. Survival wasn't luck, it was legacy. And now let the story soften. The night outside fades to stillness, and the huts we've been wandering through slowly dissolve into memory. The fire burns low, the straw settles, and the clucking of chickens gives way to a gentle hush. You breathe in, long and slow, imagining the cool air of a medieval night, and you breathe out, feeling the comfort of your own warm space around you. The peasants are gone now, their whispers tucked back into history, their smoky rafters collapsing into silence. But the lessons linger, their blankets of wool, their crowded beds, their little tricks to make life just warm enough. You can almost hear the crackle of their hearth, almost feel the faint weight of an extra cloak across your shoulders. And with that comes a kind of reassurance. If they could endure centuries of winters with nothing but grit and imagination, surely you can get through whatever tomorrow brings. So let the imagery slow. The huts fade into the distance. The noise of animals becomes nothing more than a soft hum in your imagination. Even the cold itself seems to retreat, replaced by a calm, steady rhythm of warmth. Your own blanket feels heavier now, your breath deeper, your eyelids heavier. The medieval world has tucked you in with its resilience, its humor, its quiet courage. You don't need to carry the cold only, the calm that comes after. Let it wash over you, steady and soothing. And now, as your thoughts drift, remember, you're safe, you're warm, and the night is yours.